Your character is what you do when everything has been taken from you and not what you do when things are going well. So that was another thing I realized at the kind of the end. I didn't get the life I planned, the wealth, the success. My daughters joke about it. Imagine how rich we would be if you stayed in that career. But and I laugh because they're right in one sense, but in another sense, we're in a way richer than I think we would have been had I stayed in that career. It's just more about how we measure it. It's more about moments than wealth.
Hello, welcome back. This is Andrea Parc.
And Alexa Dumitru.
And this is Alive.Again podcast, a podcast where attorneys and other professionals meet to discuss real life challenges and how our decisions shaped our journeys. Our guest today is Tom Hardin. He is a former Wall Street analyst who became one of the most prolific informants in financial crime investigations under Tipper X. His story is documented in his book, Wired on Wall Street, and what makes it so compelling, it's not only the legal part of it, but the psychology behind it. Thank you, Tom, so much for being here with us. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
We have similar kind of situation, professionals under pressure, got into trouble. And what struck me in your story is that you immediately realized the consequences and you chose to cooperate. I didn't. I chose to fight. The attorney in me chose to fight. And this is what I would like to discuss with you today. Why you chose that? Because it's very interesting for listeners to understand that. But before that, because Alexa is always asking me for more details, can you please give us a brief gist of what happened?
The very short version, I was a young financial analyst on Wall Street right before the financial crisis. So going back to 2008, 2009, working in the hedge fund industry. I knew at the time that insider trading was rampantly going on. So buying or selling stocks on information that's not public. Never felt I had to cross that line until my boss made our goals very short term from making money over 3 years to we have to make money every month because we had lost money at the start of our hedge fund for our investors. Rationalized at the time. I received 4 insider tips, placed small trades, told myself the classic rationalizations. Everybody else is doing it. Who am I hurting? I'll just do it one time. If my boss has a problem, he'll ask me. And that's no excuse. Cheating is a choice. And I want to make that clear. And it's in the book. It's clear. I did choose to cheat just because I felt everybody else was doing it was not an excuse. Never really thought about it after 4 trades over 7 months until July of 2008, which we'll talk about. The FBI approached me on the street and then gave me an option to cooperate or not. I guess other dire consequences, and it's a crazy story in the middle of the book, just sort of a riveting, page turning situation of scary situations. Some of them wearing wires and building a relationship with people. This went on for 2 years until my name was leaked to the press, and I wasn't sentenced for 7 years. So between the FBI approaching me and sentencing was most of my 30s. And I was sentenced to no prison because I helped out the FBI, what's called a time served sentence. Never thought I'd be sharing this story. I'm trying to figure out how to rebuild my life. And the FBI invited me to speak 10 years ago. And from there, I've been a corporate trainer, keynote speaker all over the world, really trying to use my scars, my own decisions as service to people in my old industry and in other industries as to how well educated, well meaning professionals can get inside their head and cross these lines and have consequences that none of us want.
Thank you. So let's go back to when the FBI tapped you on the shoulder. What was, before you started to rationalize, what was your first thought?
So it was a Tuesday morning, July 8th, 2008, 6:30 a.m. I'm stepping out of a dry cleaner in Midtown Manhattan before getting a taxi to work when somebody behind me says, "Are you Thomas Covey Hardin?" My full name, the last time I heard my full name was my mom back in Georgia about to punish me. And so it wasn't my mom, it was two FBI agents, wallets out, dark suits, come sit down with us. So it was just like a movie scene. Um, they sat me down at a Wendy's in Midtown West and said they knew about my four trades the previous year. They knew I was just down in Georgia at my baby nephew's baptism, and they knew my baby nephew's first name, who was 6 weeks old. They knew everything. And my first thought was not about prison or anything. It was like, oh my God, my dad's going to kill me. What's he going to say? All he could talk about was my success, his son, Wall Street successful. He's going to be disappointed. And then I thought, oh my gosh, my wife Sue's going to leave me. We just got married. She had no idea about my four trades. She's going to leave. And I thought, this might impact my career. And then I thought, oh my gosh, I might be going to prison. But it went from disappointing my dad to the idea of going to prison. So it was really, I think that sort of tells you when dad comes first. It was more about what we really care about when the floor drops out.
Yeah. Probably shame and guilt and identity.
Everything, everything. Yeah, all wrapped up.
Have you ever thought that was my first question when I read your book?
Mhm.
Have you ever thought how your life would have turned out if you didn't have cooperated?
I've thought about that. I think, as I described in the book, there was no gray area about my case. I knew I was receiving tips. I knew I rationalized crossing that line, so it wasn't like well, in a sense, it caught me by surprise that it was a criminal investigation. Um, had I not cooperated, I definitely at the time would have been looking at some prison time. The sentencing guideline for financial crimes on my insider trading was 3 years. And at that time, judges were even going above the sentencing guidelines for Wall Street defendants because there was a very big populist movement called Occupy Wall Street, where any defendant, was being accused for the financial crisis. And so I think definitely I would have gone to prison. I don't know. My wife Sue, people will see in the book, is the hero of all this. She has such amazing character, but if I was away from her for a few years, I'm not sure the marriage would have survived. And I think that would have been the hardest thing at that time. So had I not cooperated, the outcome would have been worse in the sense of separation from her.
We know Occupy Wall Street because she went to school on Broad Street. Right, a
Oh,
block
right
over
there.
from the exchange. So we would come
Zuccotti
out
Park,
of the
right? Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
We would come out of the train
yeah.
station 4 or 5 at Wall Street, station on Broadway, right by the Trinity Church, and we would go
Yes.
down Exchange Street to her school, which was on Broad Street, right the next block from the stock exchange. And we would pass through those people, the Occupy Wall Street, which was for, I don't remember, a few months.
And even the insider traders who chose to go to trial, the prosecutors would say, Mr. and Mrs. Jury, you can't pay your mortgage because this person traded this stock, which was not true at all. And so these people were guilty of insider trading for the most part, but the way that they didn't go after the bankers in the mortgage fraud crisis, they went after the traders was, I think, delivering scalps to the public. But the prosecutor who ran these cases, I wasn't really kind to him in my book. I just felt like he did not go after the actual real bad actors in the system at that time.
And also, I want you to mention the total amount of your trades.
Oh, yes. So this is usually shocking. On the four trades, what I personally made was $46,000. And I never thought about the money as I was making these trades as a young man, as a young professional. I was more insecure about not being part of the end group who had the information, who was older than me, much wealthier than me, and I thought kind of left out. So I had that insecurity. And once I got the tips and the information from the woman I mentioned in the book, now I felt I had status. So I never thought about the money. When I started sharing my story years ago, people said, "Oh, I thought Tipper X was the one that made millions." I said, "No, the average people in these cases, the median disgorgement in an insider trading case in the US is $58,000. So you think about the opportunity cost of my career, which I talk to NYU every year, this professor who calculates, I would have made $23 million in my career is just as a calculation, and I threw it all away for $46,000. So it was more about not having status, wanting to be part of a group, and had nothing to do with the amount of money I made personally.
Yeah. I love how you explained the belonging feeling. So,
Yes,
for
that
everyone
was
listening, this is the book that you really need to read. I think that for any kind of professional, this book should be a must
yes.
in
I
school.
I wrote it for my young self, but also anybody who just I was so focused on, okay, when I'm high school as a boy, I have to get into an Ivy League college. And then that wasn't enough. I had to get into the investment bank. And then there was the hedge fund. I never felt like I had achieved enough when maybe there was a point there in my life I could have paused and just said, hey, I'm doing quite well. Now I'm at this great hedge fund situation with this legend, Julian Robertson at 28 years old. I'm doing well. Why do I have to keep looking for places where, where I'm not, where I felt like I was less than? Like I could have just been more focused on, myself and being happy with where I was.
Now, since you have your own young children, how do you go about teaching them this idea of enough and how that doesn't really mean anything?
Yeah, 100%. Especially today, my daughters are teenage girls. So you think about, I have more gray hair every few months, but really, they're always, it's hard to keep them off social media. They're always comparing themselves against others, and somebody else is doing something. Especially now, my older one can see when she's not invited to a party, or, now they call them functions. They try to trick us, but I know it's parties, and you can see that. And thank God, when I was a kid, there was no cell phones, and so I didn't have to go through that. And it's just reassuring her that she has, her own identity and not to worry about what other people are doing. But as a 40-something-year-old father talking to your 16-year-old daughter, it's easier for me to say than do. And they both worry about, what they want to be when they grow up. Now they're all concerned about what AI is going to replace. And for me, and my wife, we always try to tell them it's not about what you want to be when you grow up, or what it's who you want to be. The kind of person you want to be is what you need to focus on. The what will change, but focus on who you are, who you want to be as a person. Because I never thought about that. It was always about status, not being part of the group. And so with them, we focus on that. And then with my story, and I catch them in their own rationalizations. This group is doing this, or at this party they're drinking this. I'll say, hey, one decision can really impact your life, and there's going to be consequences for any decision. And so they'll say, Dad, you and your psychology, but no, no, this is Dad's lived experience, right? So I look at it as a benefit of having gone through this, that for them, my story can be of service to them. So I just always focus on one decision, one holding something could really impact your college outcome because this thing gets around and it's not something you're thinking about at the time. So to be hyper vigilant about the decisions you make. So, I try to use it as a positive for their lives and their decisions.
Let's go back to before the first trade. What do you think would have stopped you from placing the first trade?
I think honestly, one one conversation, if I had picked up the phone and called one person, maybe a mentor, as I mentioned in the book, 20 something Tom didn't really have any mentors to set him straight on a sort of career path. If I would have called somebody and said, you won't believe everybody's doing this, I told myself, this woman just called me. I'm thinking about placing one trade one time. I called it taking a flyer. The right mentor, I think, would have slapped me around. Why would you ever do that? Here's what you're thinking about, Tom, and here's what you're not seeing, your career, your reputation. You're going to get caught. It was very easy for me as I wrote to override my own perception of myself. I'm a good guy. I talk about moral licensing where we can do good and that gives us license to do bad. I overrode that and made these decisions. If I had been talking to a mentor or even Sue, my wife, and said, I'm thinking about doing it one time, they will slap me around, right? And it's very hard, I think, to do something to disappoint your mentor or your spouse because then you're letting them down. And so I think if I had just hung up the phone, talked to a mentor, I probably would have ended that relationship with the woman I mentioned in the book and not continued forward because I suspected she was already insider trading. So I don't think it would have taken a whole lot because it wasn't about the money. Oh, I'm going to make a bunch of money on this trade. It was more about just not having the status and being caught up in that. So I think it would have been just one phone call, talking to the right person.
You decided to cooperate pretty fast. What
Hmm.
was the conversation in your mind, your thought process that made you decide that beyond your dad?
Yeah. I shared after the agents left me at the Wendy's, they said, I can't tell anybody, or I could only tell Sue, my wife, but I violated that. I had converted to Catholicism for marriage. She's a devout Catholic. And I walked right into St. Patrick's Cathedral. And so right after lunch, there was a long line. I thought, I had gallows humor. How many hedge fund people are in line to talk to the priest? But went and talked to the priest. I was looking around and got into that box, closed the door. And the last time I had been to confession, which I love it as part of the Catholic Church, you get everything off your chest, was when I was marrying Sue. Hadn't gone. Now was a good time for a confession. Told the priest everything. And basically he said, well, it sounds like, most of your life you've done the right thing. Here you've really screwed up. But if the FBI has given you a chance to clean up the industry, you should do it. So that was my penance. Now, as we were talking about before, I should have talked to a lawyer, but I talked to a priest. I called the FBI and I said, I was confessing to them now. I already violated what you said. I talked to a priest. They said, that's fine. But the hardest part, and actually what got me really cooperating, was when I had to tell Sue. And it was Tuesday morning when the FBI approached me. I waited till Friday. As I wrote, I was having panic attacks, bed sweats. I don't really think I was suicidal, but there was two people like me the FBI approached who killed themselves that day. I waited till Friday after work, told her everything, and she said, "Can you say that again?" And I told her everything, and she paused with what felt like forever, and she said, "Hey, if the FBI's given you a chance to clean up the industry," which I already told her was corrupt, that I should do it. And as I said, I think most wives, would have kicked out their husband right there. Several of Sue's friends have read the book and they can't believe that she stayed with me. They texted her, "I would have kicked my husband out right there." So she's the real hero. It wasn't easy for her, but um, after that conversation, it was basically the conversation I kept having with myself is there's going to be no version of this then where where I can go back to my old life, right? And that the only question then is kind of what kind of person I was going to be going forward.
What struck me was that you didn't have an attorney.
Right. Yeah.
What now, if would have been to happen again, would you choose to get an attorney first?
It's something one of the hardest things for me to sort of think about is it's a genuine regret. When the FBI approached me on the sidewalk that morning, I actually asked, should I talk to an attorney first? And the agent said, we'll let you know when you can do that. So I cooperated for about 2 years without a lawyer. And when they finally told me it was time to get one, I Googled a few white collar defense attorneys and I found a great attorney, Larry. And I said, "Hey, Larry, now the name Tipper X was out there. I'm Tipper X." And the FBI said, "We should talk now because I have to proffer with the US attorney." And he said, "Who was your attorney before me?" And I said, "You're the first I've spoken to." He said, "Tom, you're supposed to hire me the first day the FBI approached you." I said, "You know what? It's my first time doing this." So I'm just taking their advice. I think it would have changed things. I think an attorney would have structured my cooperation from day one. That they may have negotiated some protections in these crazy situations where I was wearing a wire against very powerful people. They would have made sure, I think, that I wasn't being manipulated by the psychological tactics that the FBI is trained to use. So, and they're very good at what they do. The agents would say things like, Tom, you're helping your country. Who else can you bring us? And I was so deep into it that at one point I actually thought, this is silly. Maybe they would hire me after this is all over. Maybe it would be like Frank Abagnale in the movie Catch Me If You Can. And that's how delusional I'd become. So I think an attorney would have been a reality check to that I desperately needed. That said, as I look back, I don't regret cooperating. I just regret not having the guidance to do it properly.
Yeah. Of course, they said don't get an attorney involved.
Yeah,
That's
that's right.
nor when I read
Yeah,
that in your book, what else would they have responded? I
yeah,
mean, it's normal.
that's right.
They don't
Yeah,
want anyone getting involved in with their tactics, as you say.
that,
And we
that's right.
all know
Yeah.
that the government likes cooperators. And in my story, because I was so defiant and so in my head that this is so they were attacking my identity.
Yes.
I'm not somebody that commits fraud. So I was in such a denial. So this was immigration fraud, technically. They had all the filings.
Yeah.
And I said no. And I went to trial, which is it was a very bad decision because everything that could go wrong went wrong in my case. And reading your story, I realized what could have happened if I wouldn't be so defiant and in denial as to the case.
I think people don't realize, and I think these stats are right, that 95% of people plea or 97% of people plea, only 3 to 5% go to trial. People at
Two.
trial are found guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it?
It's
Okay. So yeah,
2%. 2% of
okay.
people choose to go to trial and less than 1%
Wow.
win.
Wow. I didn't know it was even that small. Wow. Okay. Nobody really knows that. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Is there any repercussions that you face now from your former peers being Tipper X?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Tipper X was identified first in the documents. There was 20 people arrested one day when the agent called me and said, turn on TV. And I was the only name that wasn't. And as I mentioned, I'm an analyst. I could figure out who Tipper X was. And I thought, am I in danger? And my name became public after I drew the line at my cooperation. I had to draw a line somewhere and it became public. And I was concerned about, repercussions. And I got a few threatening sort of texts or emails or communications that I forwarded to the FBI, and they told me they checked them out and I was okay. And so I will often Google people in these cases just to see where they are now. And it's really interesting that, these reputation management firms can actually take a lot of the bad stuff or push it down the Google search. So some of the people aren't even found on Google or the stuff is pushed down. And so I often wonder what they're up to today. And it's hard to find a lot of information. I don't know about you and Andrea, but I get these emails all the time, from
I know.
reputation managers. Mr. Hardin, we found something bad about you on the internet for a certain price. I'm sure they'll clean it up. And I always email them back. Oh my gosh, here's tipperx.com. All the bad stuff is there. And then they'll email back. Oh, it looks like the person that owns tipperx.com is using your name. And then I think they eventually figure out I'm playing with them. But like, I just thought, why not own the story? Why try to clean it up off of Google? Like, it's not going to go away. And maybe if I don't talk about it, it will help no one. And if I own it and discuss the decisions, maybe it'll help people. So it's interesting how this works today.
Yeah, I know. I build my entire business currently based on my story and what happened
Right?
back
Yep.
then, because everything that happened to me was within a week, both cases, state and federal. I
Wow.
had two cases, both in the
Wow.
same week. And for the next few months, I had 10 pages of Google where my name would show up.
Doesn't go away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no. And I don't want them to go away because that's basically the proof that my
The backbone.
story, the backbone, the explanation.
Yeah, no, it's your scars can become your service, right? Absolutely. I mean, why not use it for good now?
What I wanted to ask you is, have you ever thought if you haven't cooperated, could have you returned to practicing being a financial analyst?
I don't think so. Like when I would have, definitely been charged as I was today, as a cooperator, it's still the same outcome in terms of a securities fraud conviction. And, that's pretty much not going to allow me reentry to the old industry. And I do miss that line of work even to this day. And now it's interesting because the hedge funds have me back, but not as an analyst, as a compliance trainer. And it's really hard to kind of take that skill set of analyzing businesses and trading stocks and using it in other lines of work. And so I don't think I would have been allowed back, but I don't think I would have been able to be a good analyst again because I would be. It's interesting because you have to be kind of comfortable with getting close to the line, and then going through this experience. Obviously, I'd be much more risk averse, so I don't think I would have been able to go back.
When you go and you speak in these places to financial analysts or to the FBI or to
Mhm.
schools, do you see
Yeah.
people that you recognize tendencies in that you had?
Yes, when people are focused on so much on their resume virtues. One of the books that really opened me up 10 years ago was David Brooks' The Road to Character, when he just had this amazing insight about people are so focused on their resume, the next job, the next title, the next status. Yes, we all have to be focused on that in our careers to some extent. But when I talk to people, and especially my daughter now, she's in 10th grade, we're almost going through this crazy college experience where it's about where do you apply, like it's all about the status of the school. If you're not thinking about what Brooks describes as eulogy virtues, again, not what do you want to be, but who do you want to be, you're in a situation where you may blow up your life because you're so focused on the resume and what you want to be. And so I see that as a constant problem to this day. And so I'm not, hopefully nobody's committing crimes, but again, it's that idea of whatever it takes to have that title or that status, I think is still a problem. Whether I'm talking to schools because I'm speaking at Fordham and they're going to be looking at jobs at the major investment banks and which one can I get and what does it takes, and not just being sort of more content about who you are and where you are in life, I think is still a struggle for high achieving people,
Intelligent people.
intelligent people.
Because intelligence doesn't save us from ourselves.
It does not.
Yeah. At what point in your life did you accept what happened?
Yeah, it took a while. It was a process, as I really wrote about in the book. When I started owning it, there was a couple points I went through kind of the shame spiral and shame and guilt. Guilt is I did a bad thing, and shame is I'm a terrible person. And I would follow the cases, and I mentioned, I couldn't believe the prosecutor never charged anybody at a bank that was, laundering money for El Chapo at that time at HSBC, and these were New York employees, and the bank just paid the fine and went on. And I looked at Sue and said, "Can you believe this?" And of course, Sue, who kept me so grounded, said, "Is that helping you with your job search?" Right? You can't control. You can only focus on what you can control. So that helped. But really, it was at the moment, as I shared, when she had been holding down the fort. She worked at Lehman Brothers. She worked at other companies. That was really not. It was not a great situation in terms of, are these companies going to survive? It was still after the crisis, and then one day she came home from a new job, was emotional, and I had made, as I shared, $3,000 speaking one time. And I just said, "Sue, you can leave your job now." And she's like, "Are you crazy? $3,000 is not going to pay the mortgage and then the cost of raising two kids." But that was where I had to finally own it. I had to get out of this shame spiral. I'm not a terrible person. I did a bad thing, but I have to like own it and figure out a way that I can provide for my family because my wife had been holding it down unbelievably well through all this stress. And so that was also part of like just owning it and going out there and trying to make meaning out of it. And I did, as I shared, it wasn't really how do I make money from it? It was just going to share it as a pilgrimage at all these colleges. And then one day, another big thing in ownership, and I know you talk about this, is I spoke at a law school for the first time. They told me I made some mistakes and really paid for it. And the word mistake made me feel about much better than if I had to say I made bad decisions. And so this is something that Craig Stanlin, another person in our group, and I talk about all the time. It's like if you call your mistakes, if you call your bad decisions mistakes, you're not really owning them. Like we both make mistakes and bad decisions. And so another unlock for me in owning this and accepting responsibility was saying, no, I didn't make mistakes. I made bad decisions. You know, I carried, a bag of an envelope of cash through the airport for an insider trading tip. That was not a mistake. I made a conscious choice to place those trades. I made a conscious choice to pass the information, and calling them mistakes up until that point through all of this was a way to keep myself from real change. And so once I stopped hiding behind that word, for me, everything shifted. And the audiences that I started speaking to after that could feel the difference. The students pushed me harder and I went deeper. And that's when I think the healing actually started, and not so much from self-focus, but from being useful to other people.
Have you been asked a question in one of your speaking endeavors that left you kind of in shock?
Yeah, there's actually one that came early that has come up a few times more, but I answered it incorrectly. So I mentioned I spoke to a school, a high school. Again, this wasn't a company called Roxbury Latin outside Boston, kind of one of the oldest high schools in the country. And there was a 10th grader or 11th grader, probably a 16-year-old boy, who asked me if the FBI had not stopped me on the street that day, would I have continued to make trades on inside information? And it was when just came into my head. I said, yes, I would have stopped. But as I thought about it, I thought I just lied to like a 16-year-old kid about that's not true. And I got off stage. I told the headmaster, I have to correct this. If the FBI didn't stop me, I would have kept doing it because my boss was looking the other way. I told myself everybody else is doing it. Nobody's saying anything. So in a way, at that time, I didn't feel like the FBI stopping me was there was anything good to this. But as I look back and with the hindsight now, I feel like they did me a favor by stopping me after 4 trades because it would have continued. So that question, the time I received it, I wasn't prepared for it because I wanted to rewrite history. I wanted to say, oh yes, after the fourth tip, I was going to tell her, please stop calling me with this perfect information, right? That wasn't going to happen. So that's one question that always has me thinking, that it's uncomfortable to say I wouldn't have stopped, but it's the truth.
What do you think would have happened if you wore the wire on those two friends?
There's a point in the book where the agent sort of asking me who else. And now I had an attorney and I said, I'm done. And the agent said, no, there's 2 more guys who I just thought these are great men. I knew them since college. They're both starting on their own families. I just felt even inside the worst version of myself, there's a line. And I had crossed so many lines by that point, legal lines, ethical lines, lines I never imagined I'd cross. But this was different with these 2 guys. They weren't really targets on an FBI list. They were friends who had trusted me. And yes, I had already hurt them by bringing them into the Chronos trade. But there's a difference, I think, between having done something terrible to people you care about and actively choosing to destroy them to save yourself. And that's where my cooperation ended, basically. The FBI told me my name was coming out the next day, and it did. And if I had agreed to cooperate on them, um, I don't know. They were never charged. They moved on with their careers. Had I worn a wire on them, their lives might have been destroyed the way mine was, and I would have had to carry that. And so I'm not sure I could have. And I'd already lost so much of myself during those 2 years of undercover work that losing that last piece, like, I don't know, the ability to look at myself and say I drew a line somewhere, I think that would have sort of finished me. I hate to think about it, but probably.
Yeah. But do you think that they would have kept your name from releasing?
To your point, I think the outcome would have been the same. I mean, it would have been okay after those two. Who's next? And it was up to me to draw the line. Or my
Yeah.
attorney, he couldn't believe that I'd worn a wire 48 times and I wasn't the target of this investigation. I had made, as I said, $46,000. So I think he would have drawn the line somewhere, but I felt I had to draw the line there, and I had no time to tell any other family because my name came out, literally that afternoon.
Many successful professionals don't believe that anything like this can happen to them. If someone is under investigation, finds out it's under investigation, what is the first mistake or the mistake that people make in the first 24 hours?
So I lived that. The number one mistake is talking without an attorney, and so full stop. Um, I'm the poster child for this. I cooperated with the FBI for 2 years before I spoke to a lawyer. He said I should have talked to one the first day. The FBI, law enforcement, is exceptionally skilled at psychological persuasion, as we were talking about. They framed my cooperation as my patriotic duty, and they build rapport, right? And so they make you feel like you're on the same team, and you might be, but you need someone in your corner whose job it is to protect your rights and not build a case. So if you're ever in that situation, say nothing, call a lawyer. Everything else can wait. And a lot of times the FBI does what are called fishing expeditions, where maybe you didn't actually do anything wrong, but you traded a stock at the same time as another company who was doing something wrong. They'll approach everybody and try to scare people. And once you start talking, even if you're not guilty, as we know, that consequences can escalate. And so take their card and say nothing and see what your options are.
What do you think the personality trait is between a person who cooperates and one who fights?
I think there's probably a difference, but maybe it's not what people expect. I would like to think it's not, that informants are weaker or more scared. People might hear this and think, oh, he's a rat or he's just doing it to save himself. In my experience, I don't know. I think the people who cooperate tend to be the ones on some level who already knew what they were doing was wrong. I know in your case it was a shock situation. In mine, when they approached me and they started laying out my trades, like I, in a way, accepted responsibility because I knew that I had crossed the line. I had been carrying that cognitive dissonance, and when the FBI showed up, there was almost a strange relief in a way mixed with terror. It's like two different thoughts at the same time that this is over, and the people, just generalizing, the people that maybe that tend to fight have convinced themselves that they did nothing wrong, and that they believe they can beat the case. And I could tell you that there's no hero narrative in this. No one's a martyr for fighting the system. And I would say, we know that you laid out the stat earlier that it's pretty shocking to people that you need to really get an attorney in those first 24 hours, get somebody who could think clearly when you can't. And that's the single most important thing you can do in the first, 24 hours.
Now, looking back at your experience, what do you think, what it taught you that you didn't know, you didn't see back then?
Yeah, and this wasn't really evident to me until I started writing the book last year. I've been sharing my story for 9 years, which was the transcript of that talk is like 7,000 words, and the book is 82,000 words. So I had to really, really tear myself apart. And I would say the life I was chasing wasn't the life I actually wanted. I spent my entire 20s obsessed with these resume virtues, the titles, the funds, and that reframe on eulogy virtues was important. My grandfather, I mentioned in the book, survived the Bataan Death March, and he was a POW, nearly starved to death. He was saved by friends. He came home. He didn't brag, right? He taught Clemson he served, and he quietly embodied the values that had kept him alive. And so for decades, I knew his story, but didn't really understand it. It was until my own life fell apart that I saw the lesson about your character is what you do when everything has been taken from you and not what you do when things are going well. So that was another thing I realized. And, you know, I really at the kind of the end, I didn't get the life I planned, the wealth, the success. My daughters joke about it. Imagine, how rich we would be if you stayed in that career. And I laugh because they're right in one sense, but in another sense, we're in a way richer than I think we would have been had I stayed in that career. It's just more about how we measure it. It's more about moments than wealth. And Andrea, I think your framework that you share, Apple, when I heard you lay that out on a podcast, I thought, that's exactly kind of my arc too. I just didn't have the language for it. So the awareness, the perspective, the presence, the letting go. And then I think the empowerment part was just for me to like find a voice through the speaking journey, discovering that this story could help people. And I know that you've said, I think you said, you can correct me, that the body can be imprisoned, but the mind can't. And that was just so much of what I went through in prison. I didn't go to prison, but I was in prison in my mind. And I think that's exactly right. I was imprisoned by the shame, right? Not the bars that you had. And the experience was trying to teach me how to walk out of that sort of cell in my head. And it just took me a long time to find the door.
Thank you for sharing that. That was really beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think prison was the only way to be forced out of that cage of my mind because the door was wide open. I created the cage. And I was just only with the suffering of prison time and suffering having her alone at home that made me walk out of that
Yeah.
cage. Yeah. And as you say, it's having money. So many people have everything that we can imagine with wealth, but somehow they're empty. Because I, as an attorney and CFO, I had a decent lifestyle. We had a decent lifestyle, but the connection was empty between
Yeah.
us. Now is rich, the connection, because yeah, I think that money is just a tool, not what brings us real fullness of life.
Yeah. That's very well said. I agree.
Well, Tom, this was wonderful. And now we have one last question, which I ask every guest, and that is, aside of your responsibilities and work and family, what is one activity in your life that makes you feel more alive?
People that read the book will know I probably say it is running. So I think it really, at the time, saved my life when everything fell apart. My career was gone. There was the felony. I couldn't get hired anywhere, as we all go through. I was a stay-at-home dad. I got so out of shape that when I started running, that just sort of became, it taught me things I couldn't learn elsewhere, that the pain's not going to go away, but you can keep moving through it. And even today, I can't run as much as I used to. I have problems with my knees and hips, and my doctor said, well, a body only has so many miles, Tom, and you've used them all back for those ultra marathon days. And so today, one of the great things that I've been able to experience is actually coaching my younger daughter in basketball. And I wasn't allowed to coach years ago because I couldn't pass the background check. And I'm just most happy today when I'm at practice. And this happened last week where we have 12 players on the team, and there's one girl who's clearly not the best player, and but at practice she made like a 3-pointer, which she never did, and all the girls are cheering. So I was like, wow, this is what it's all about now. That's just like where I'm happiest, being able to coach, today and have that experience that I wasn't able to do years ago with my first daughter when there was always all the issues with the background checks.
Thank you so much. And again, please purchase the book. It's wealth of information and psychology and everything that you need in this book. And by the way, we purchased the tickets. We'll see you on the at the signing.
Yes.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. And we will definitely link the book in the description of the video.
Great.
Thank you so much for
Thank you
being
so
here.
much. I was starting to get emotional. Like that doesn't happen too often now, but just thank you for all the questions and the discussion. This is great. Yeah.
Thank you. Our listeners, thank you very much for listening. For more conversations and more guests, please subscribe and follow us.